All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Garrett Channell. I am the newest staff member here at the Salem Museum. I'm the Director of Education and Archives. So I'm a graduate of Roanoke College. I had a major in history with a focus in public history. I had a couple of study away experiences at Roanoke, first being studying history and literature at Oxford University for a semester. I also worked at a few different preservation-based institutions. So one being the Library of Congress. I did an internship for a semester. I also worked for the Roanoke College Archives. While in college, I also volunteered at the museum and their collections and at events before being hired. And now I work full time. So I'm working on field trips and programs for all ages and helping with exhibits and kid-centered aspects of exhibits. I also work with the collection, processing, and accessioning items. And today, I am happy to be talking to you about the history of the phonograph and the history of recorded sound. So, first and foremost, February 11th, 1847 was Edison's birthday. So he would be 175 this year, so this is a timely talk that we are giving this week. And today I wanted to focus on one of his inventions. So before he even did the light bulb, he invented a recorded sound, which we still, of course, use today. So he, in 1877, so 30 years old, was just tinkering with ways to record sound. He was trying to record telegraph messages at first, but then realized he could do sound recording. So first he used paper, and then once he realized that was successful, he took a metal cylinder and wrapped it in tinfoil. And that's how we have the very first phonograph. So real quick, the scope for this presentation, I'm hoping to mainly focus on, of course, what he did. We're going to go through the history of Edison and his main competitors, but we're also going to be jumping forward in time some and talking about how some items that we think of as very modern, recent inventions actually have their basis in much, much earlier. And I hope some of those will surprise you as you're watching this. A couple of quick things. Just so you know, these headings are my own. So these are not things you can Google and find as like official ways to divide the phonograph era, as I would choose to call it, roughly from 1877 to 1930. These are fully my own. The other thing is this is just going to focus on American innovation. So yes, London had a big phonograph scene, a manufacturing scene, but we won't really be focusing on that in this presentation. But yeah, with that, we will start with the very beginning. So like I mentioned, it began with Edison just messing around with ways to record messages. So you can see here on the right, the original idea that he had was just, again, metal cylinder wrapped in aluminum foil. That bottom picture, you can see it indenting in. So basically what you did is you spoke into this, and then you have the needle and that paper, and it's just hitting into it, recording the sound waves that way. And originally this was not necessarily designed for music. That was one aspect of it. But originally, Edison built it just as a general recording device. He thought businesses would use it. Fans of horror novels will be familiar with this from Dracula and some H.P. Lovecraft stories. There are multiple characters in those that record their diaries on phonographs. He also kind of had an early public history view for like oral histories. One of the billings was you could record your grandma telling a story and then play it for your kids and grandkids someday. Now, there were some limitations on this. One thing that they quickly realized was that aluminum foil only allowed for 2 or 3 playbacks. Basically, what you would do is you're cranking this, recording your message, then you'd reset it, and then crank it and just let that same needle read it back to you. And so they needed something better that was a little more long lasting. Thankfully, Alexander Graham Bell, yes, the telephone Alexander Graham Bell, came up with the first wax cylinder. So he, again, just used that metal, just like a metal cylinder and coated it in wax. and then you would record sound into that, and then let it dry, and it would play for have a lot more playbacks, I should say. Now, the other thing that was different is I just mentioned that Edison recorded his up and down. Alexander Graham Bell's recorded side to side, which would become the main way that sound recordings were done, well, until today with modern pressings of vinyl. That is the way that sound recording is. It records the sound wave side to side instead of up and down. You're going to see throughout this presentation, Edison always needed to be different. That's just one of his things. He had to be different than his competitors and everyone else. So he would actually maintain that vertical method of cutting discs and records in general, until he would finish in 1929. After that, after Graham Bell, we had 1887, three things happen. First, Edison formally forms the Edison Phonograph Company. One of the first things they do is make their own wax record to compete with Graham Bell's idea. Second, Columbia Records was founded. Now, originally, they were not their own company. They were actually just a distribution plant for Edison Records. So they were in Washington, D.C., where the name Columbia came from. And they began just distributing Edison's records at phonograph machines. But we will see their evolution over this presentation. And today they are the oldest record label in existence from this year. And most importantly, we have Emil Berliner. Now, Berliner realized that there were still issues with the cylinders, especially the aluminum foil ones, but the wax ones, he thought that you could do a little bit better. Now, remember, prior to this, it was a metal cylinder with something around it. Berliner is the first one to record directly into the material. He used a material called shellac, which would become the name of the records from this period. The 78s that were produced are also sometimes called shellac records. He also was the first person to use a disc. So you can see a picture of that here. He used a disc to record the sound and play it back. And today we have that iconic look of what we conceptualize as a record when we hear that word. And it is thanks to this invention, 87, and a few other companies that will pick it up in the coming years. So with that, we will move into the next section, which I've called branching out, which is all the companies. We see the emergence of a couple other companies, and we see a lot of different innovations. Now, I mentioned before, Edison originally did not intend for this to be just for music. He had lots of different ideas for how they could be done, including for Edison Talking Dolls. So this is an ad for them from a magazine. I would recommend doing a Google search for them. They are quite creepy today, but they're fun and a really important innovation. Most people, when they think of talking dolls, they think that the earliest one's going to be Chatty Cathy in the 1950s. But no, 1890, we get the first ever talking dolls. So basically the way they worked, you can see the mechanic there on the right. You can also see on the left that fully clothed doll has that little crank sitting next to her. It was just a tiny little phonograph cylinder. And he would have the women that worked for him in his different workshops and factories. They came in, they recorded nursery rhymes and children's prayers and little sayings. So each one of these was unique. And you can hear recordings today. You can look those up on YouTube. But this, of course, would set the precedent for all the future talking toys that we would have from this point to the 1920s. They had the mama dolls, to getting into later battery powered, and today all the electronic powered ones. That all began with Edison. Now, the other thing that he did was he had the first ever jukebox. So yes, also in 1890 we had the coin slot phonograph. So you can see an example of that on the left. This one is not as far as the jump to see how it led straight to the jukebox. But yeah, that was an Edison invention as well. Not many people remember that today. They just think of the 1940s jukebox. I think that's where it started. Now I mentioned before that each one of the dolls were individually recorded. This was true of all phonographs at the time. A major problem with these cylinders early on, so there was no method of mass reproducing them. So every record that was produced, they basically had to pay for the artist to come in and just sit down all day and record as many records as they could. I've seen estimates that they could get maybe 50 to 80 in, depending on how hard the artist worked and how many hours. But that was costly. I mean, that was costly time-wise, and you didn't get that much of a return, plus paying the artist for that long. So in 1901, we get the gold mold records. And they are called gold molded records because the way that they're made, you actually have this golden vapor is produced by the process of the machines. But this way they just had a mold for the wax. We're no longer putting them onto the metal cylinder first. It is going straight into the wax. And the best part of this is it produces 150 to 180 cylinders a day. 120 to 150 cylinders a day. It also brings down the price. So before this, most cylinders were around 50 cents a piece. This brings it down a couple of years later to 35 cents a piece because it's so much cheaper and easier to produce these now. With that, we'll move to Columbia Records. So in jumping back a couple of years, in 1894, Columbia severed ties with Edison and began producing their own, recording their own artists, making their own records. And you can see an example of that on the left, an early ad for them. You can also see that they were 25 cents, so they were a little bit cheaper than the competitor with Edison. And in 1901, they began producing discs. So they are working with Berliner's ideas. So they're recording sound side to side and they're putting it in a disc shape. They're actually using wax. So they're continuing to use the phonograph wax that they use for cylinders, but just pressing that into the disc instead of using the shellac material. And then we have the Victor Talking Machine Company, arguably the most popular talking machine company or phonograph company that there was. Now, Victor worked straight from Berliner's notes. So they began producing discs immediately, and they used shellac, which is what they became known as. Even Columbia discs, even if they were made of wax, if they were 78, they were still sometimes referred to as that. And so that's a large part due to Victor. So each of these companies sort of focused in their own thing. Victor produced popular music. Columbia focused more on jazz records, and Edison, ever being Edison, wanted to make it high class, high society. So he mostly recorded opera and very classical stuff. Not to say that Victor didn't, not to say that Columbia didn't. They all recorded what they could, but they did in general have these fields their genres that they stuck within. The other big thing that Victor did was in 1905, they introduced the cabinet unit. This was mostly a way to market towards middle class families. So before this, you had ones like from the painting on the left, His Master's Voice, where it just sat on the table and you had the needle directly hooked up to the horn that was sticking up, and that's how it ran. The way these cabinets unit worked is that you had the mechanism on top, and then inside is the speaker. And so the way that you did volume control at this point, because you don't have a remote or anything like that, you don't have buttons to push like we have today on our phones. So you can see on this one how the top two flaps kind of open. That is how you control the sound. So there'd be a speaker, And if you wanted it as loud as it could be, you would just open those doors wide. If you wanted to dampen it a little bit, you would maybe close one of the doors. And we'll see an example of that later on a future slide. But these changed the game. So the idea was that middle-class families would want something that looks like a piece of furniture that blended in and maybe has some storage space. So they can store different things in it. And it's a multi-use item that justifies the cost for these families. Now, whether if anybody actually stored things other than their records in these machines, who's to say? I have not necessarily seen any reference to that, but that was the idea and it worked. I mean, that is the twofold way that Victor became so successful, was having pop music and having this marketing strategy with the cabinets. Now, as we get to the end of this decade, we start moving into the 1910s, records do begin to change. So you can see on the right here, this is a Victor record from the Salem Museum's collection, the copy of the Hallelujah Chorus. And I hope you can see this well enough on your screen that this is a one-sided disc. So on the top is the front, that's what has the recording on it. The back is just blank. So before this point, before 1908, all discs were one-sided. 1908, Columbia changed the game and introduced their double-face disc. This, of course, would become the standard when we think of records today. All records are double-sided, besides maybe some special releases for some reason. And this is because of this need to continue to evolve. Because the other side of it is cylinders could only record 2 minutes of audio, which was fine until Columbia and Victrola started putting out discs. Discs could record 4 minutes of audio, and that caused some major losses for Edison, as why would we invest in this other machine when we could instead have 4 minutes, have longer songs. And so in 1908 as well, you can see how all this competition stuff happens at the same time, introduced the Blue Amber All record. And that was a finely grooved piece, so that way they could have 4 minutes of audio and match the discs. Now, of course, now a disc has 8 minutes of audio, but we see this age of competition, but they continue to one up each other. And that's going to be the main focus for this next section before we get to 1920. This is sort of the boom of the phonographic draw. So finally, in 1911, Edison breaks down and he decides that, yes, it may be worthwhile to get into discs. He still continues to produce cylinders. Actually, at this point, Columbia's already stopped selling cylinders. Victor never got into selling cylinders. They only did discs. Edison would continue until he closed the company down, closed the factory down. But discs, of course, were much more popular. You can see an example here on the left of one of his cabinet units that he introduced in 1916. Now, one thing to know about Edison discs, again, needing to be different. Edison maintained that vertical method of cutting sound waves. So essentially what it meant was if you wanted to listen to Edison records, you had to have an Edison machine. They couldn't be read on a Victor or a Columbia, and you couldn't read Victor or Columbia discs on an Edison machine because the needle bobbed up and down instead of side to side. And then vice versa on Columbia and Victrolas, they move side to side instead of up and down. So they were not compatible at first for this competition age. And of course, he had to have a different ad campaign, something that outsplit. And so he began the tone tests. Now, this came from a marketing campaign where Edison began to bill his recordings as recreations of performances. They're not just a recording of a song. It is a recreation of a performance by an artist. And to make this point, in 1915, he began traveling with famous musicians, mostly opera stars. But what he would do is he would fill an auditorium or a music hall or wherever, he would darken the stage and then alternate, sometimes playing the phonograph recording of this artist, sometimes having the artist sing. Now, of course, no one else was there to make notes of if the audience could tell if it was the phonograph or the singer, but according to Edison, they couldn't tell. They equally voted if it was the singer or the phonograph, and didn't always get it right. Sometimes it was the phonograph, according to Edison. So this was the major ad campaign for the time. You see a lot of references when talking about Edison to his tone tests. They were widely popular. And then we have Brunswick. Now, Brunswick is very interesting. This, of course, is going to be a piece that is familiar to visitors of the Salem Museum. This lives in the Middleton Gallery, our Walter Biggs Gallery. And this is a bit of a later model, but 1913, we have Brunswick enter. So they are actually a very old company. They're from 1845. They began as just a general furniture manufacturer. They actually worked on making pianos a lot at this point in the early 1900s. But due to a, quote, slump in the piano business, they decided to go ahead and start making phonograph units and then selling it to companies. Now, at first, they did not make the full thing. They just made the wooden case that it went in, and they sent it off to a phonograph manufacturer, and they put the actual machine in it. Their number one buyer at first, Edison. They made a lot of Edison's earliest models. But after a few years, they got tired of that. In 1916, they introduced their own. They were doing both, but they kind of realized, why are we sending it off to them for them to make the money when we could just make our own phonograph? And so they would be popular until through the 1920s. So this model that you see here is ours. It is from 1926. Find that real quick. It's called a Seville. And this was a very popular model. This was a model that was constantly sold out. When you look at the records from this time, they were constantly being overbooked. Every couple months, you'd see a report that they were trying just to produce more and more of these. So at the museum, if you come and visit us, see this on display, you will see one that would be very familiar to people from 100 years ago. And you can see an example here. I was talking about the sound system earlier. On the left would be the quietest sound setting. On the right is, a midway sound setting. So you just have that one door open. So that is what we have represented with that. And this came at a major time, a major boom for manufacturers. In 1915, there are 18 phonograph manufacturers in general that either just make cabinets, make full units, 18. By 1919, there are over 200. Like I said, this is a boom time, but all good things must come to an end. In 1920, we get the introduction of the radios and the very first broadcasting channels. Of course, it would take a while for these to catch on, but throughout the 1920s, radios far surpassed phonographs in interest, and that is what led to their rise. So we'll begin with talking about Columbia. So Columbia was one of the first ones to have some financial issues. So in 1922, they went into receivership, which is a form of bankruptcy, which basically just means they're looking for someone to be partners with them and buy them out. So interestingly enough, the one that buys Columbia out is actually what was their subsidiary in London. Buys the record company first, and then by the late 1920s, they had control of everything again. And in 1926, they really focused in on having jazz deals. So they were the seller for Louis Armstrong and for Bessie Smith. And that's what really brought them back and really gave them a name again. So they were super popular thanks to the jazz offerings that they had. Now, 1920s, like I mentioned before, there were a bunch of manufacturers moving into 1919, 1920. And by this point, cabinets weren't selling as well. There was a major lull in 1921. That summer, they did not sell many cabinet units at all. So the idea was introduced. These were adapted from World War I. They made a lot of portable phonographs to send with troops overseas. And so they decided to sell those for the local markets and really bill it as like a summer machine. So it's meant to be taken on picnics in the car with you. I've seen a couple of ads about listen to it in the car, listen in your backyard, just a nice summer, take your music with you. So this piece here you see on screen is one from our collection. It actually belonged to Dr. Esther Brown. So this is one that we have back in the archives. It's called a Sorolla. So this one was produced somewhere between 1921 and 1923. And you can see that picture there on the right. Basically, there's a flap on the side. Inside, they kept the needle and the speaker. And then you would take that out and attach it onto the side and then put your disc on and listen to it that way. Now, I do think that what's really, really interesting about these is that this was the main thing that was being sold for phonographs in the 1920s. Some cabinets were still sold, of course. Like I said, Brunswick ones still maintained popularity, but the majority of sales were these portables. And then as you move out of the phonograph era, get into the record player era, which is what they called record players, in the 1930s and 40s, we move into vinyl. And one of the main complaints about vinyl is that it's not portable. So it's interesting that there was almost this mass, nobody really thought to put, to just make a vinyl one that was portable, because vinyl became much more electric based once you get to the end of the 1920s. 1925, about half of all US households have electricity in it. By the end of the decade, even more have it. Most houses are working towards having electricity. But I will say the silver lining is it does lead in the early 1960s to 8 tracks to be produced. And then as time goes on, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, we get cassette tapes. And then beyond that, you get the portable CD players and then eventually iPods, like was on the first slide or in the intro. And that is all thanks to the popularity of portables and then people complaining and lamenting in the 40s that vinyl isn't portable. And that's why we have 8 tracks, which I'm sure many of you watching will remember. But when we get to 1929 and 1930, that's sort of the end of it. So in 1929, the Radio Corporation of America purchases Victor, became RCA Victor. They are still around today, mostly known as RCA, but you will see RCA Victor in the next few decades in the record industry. 1930, Brunswick sells their phonograph and record companies to Warner Brothers Pictures. And in 1929, Edison just shuts down all phonograph manufacturing to focus on radio phonographs. So I've included this picture here of Edison next to one of the radios that his company produced as an illustration of that. I did want to move really just into a very brief epilogue and talk about sort of where it went from here. Now, I mentioned a couple times, so 78 RPM was the standard for phonographs once discs were introduced. That was what discs were made on, but originally they were actually made of a different material. So they were usually a much harder material than what we think of for records that came later. And so that is why an iconic part of phonographs is having to change the needle. It's because it was designed that the disc would wear down the needle instead of the needle wearing into the disc, which is what happens with modern records and records of the 70s and 80s, and how you would get worn out discs if you listen to it too often, or maybe just as often as you like. And so 30s and 40s, we see that evolution of material. So if you actually have a 78 RPM from the 40s, it plays differently than a 78 from the 1910s. But in the 30s and 40s, they go electric, as I mentioned, and they really work on developing new records. So in 1948, Columbia produces the first 33 1/3 record, which you can see here on the left. That is what we know of today as the modern record album, the long play albums. That is what all records would be from then on, from this main period until the resurgence of vinyl in 2008. One thing that hasn't quite made that resurgence, but was very popular, 1949, RCA Victor responded to the long play microgroove with the extended play, which of course had a single song on each side. And so we can see how both of these companies, even though they stopped phonographs, maintained popularity and really continue to make waves in the record industry. And on 82 years later, in 1959, the last pop 78s were produced. Some children's records were still made on 78 RPM until the 70s, but this record here, Buster Brown, Tanny Mae, is considered to be one of the last pop songs ever put on 78s for mass production. And so you can see how even though this was another 30 years after Edison ended his production of phonographs, you still have those direct ties to his invention with the sound waves and phonograph records just continuing on. And so I would just ask that as you listen to music, if you listen to it on the 11th or whenever you do, just share a thought for Edison. And remember, just thanks to his tinkering in his studio, that we have Spotify and CDs and all the recorded music that we have today. Thank you for watching.